also. Please welcome Gerald Early.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. And now I know, I didn't know those things Ida was saying. Thank you all for coming. I think this is a very important occasion. And I'm very honored to be the first person to speak to you. Very honored as well to be part of a cast of people, such impressive people, and colleagues of mine. I'm just really humbled, actually, to be in this cast. I have some remarks. I was asked to kind of give a certain kind of historical context for race and ethnicity. I'll try to do the best I can. It's going to be a little crunchy. I hope I can get it in the time I've been allowed it. At 9:20 a.m. on Thursday, July 16th, a 15-year-old black boy who lived in a low-income housing project ran out of an apartment vestibule, reportedly with a knife. He had run into the building while waiting for his summer school class to start, angered that the building's white owner, while cleaning his front steps, had sprayed the black teens who were milling around with his water hose. The owner thought the teens were a nuisance, and he wanted to make sure they would not sit on his steps or congregate in front of his building. He was accused of calling the students niggers, which the owner denied. But the water dousing, not the name calling, made some of the teens, most of whom were girls, particularly angry. The 15-year-old black boy grabbed a knife from his friend and followed the owner inside the building. When the boy came out a minute or so later, unable to catch the owner, he was confronted by an off-duty white police officer who saw the incident from across the street from a window of a repair shop. The policeman testified that he identified himself as a police officer and told the boy to stop. According to his testimony, the boy did not stop but came at him with the knife. The police officer fired 3 times and shot the boy twice, fatally. There were plenty of witnesses to the shooting as it occurred on a busy street in broad daylight, and the accounts were varied, often contradicting one another. Some said the boy was surrendering when he was shot. Others said the boy did not have a knife. Others said the police officer stood over the boy and shot him while he was lying on the ground. The physical evidence gathered at the scene did not, and presented to the grand jury, did not support any of these versions. This did not matter, as many blacks asked, even if the boy was armed with a knife, did the police officer really need to shoot him to death to stop him? Would the police officer have fatally shot a white teen? On September 1st, the grand jury chose not to indict the officer. The case was ruled justifiable homicide. This was a bit of an anticlimax, as not one, but 2 sections of the city broke out in rioting and violent confrontations with the police immediately after the shooting occurred. Rioting lasted for 6 days, from July 18th to July 23rd. Wait a minute. Yes, that's right. This incident did not happen in Ferguson. It did not happen last summer or even the summer before last. It happened 50 years ago in 1964 in New York City. Rioting broke out in both Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant, the black section of north central Brooklyn. Whites in those areas feared for their lives, some beaten badly without provocation, and some angry black folk at war with the police in the streets were saying the only good cop is a dead cop, and get the white occupiers out of our neighborhoods. They screamed Uncle Tom and race traitor at black policemen. The police, in several instances, returned the favor by shouting profanities at the rioters, by beating some innocent black bystanders for no reason other than being there. The police did almost nothing to stop local businesses from being looted, and the fact that the store was owned by an African American did not protect it from being looted. Some point to this 1964 incident as proof that nothing has changed in race relations in the United States over the last 50 years, as carbon copies of this incident have continued to occur. The British doughboys of World War I used to sing, "It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go." And with race relations in America, many believe we still have, so it seems, a long way to go. But 50 years can be a long time in modern human affairs, and things have changed. In 1964, abortion, sodomy, and interracial marriage were illegal in all or in a significant portion of the United States. Now none of these acts are. Immigration and the rise of women, gays, and the disabled as powerful grievance groups have also changed identity politics in America. If nothing else, the world in which we play out our race drama today is strikingly different than it used to be. Over 80% of the poor now have air conditioning. Only 36% of all American households had air conditioning in the 1960s. 93% of African American adults have cell phones, a higher percentage than whites. Today, nearly 20% of all African Americans over the age of 25 have a 4-year bachelor's degree, over 3 times the percentage of 1964. African Americans have become judges, prosecutors, wardens, highly touted fashion designers, noted academics, renowned architects, CEOs of major companies, successful Hollywood stars and filmmakers, mayors, police commissioners, highly regarded chefs, prize-winning authors and artists, famous physicians, university presidents of non-black schools, even President of the United States. Blacks occupy positions in this country that were unthinkable 50 years ago. Things do change, and things have changed. On the other hand, in 1964, African Americans made up less than 7% of the New York City police force. They make up only 10% of the current New York City police force, although they make up nearly 25% of the city's population. 20% of blacks have bachelor's degrees, compared to nearly 40% of whites and over 55% of Asians. African American 4-year college graduates are twice as likely to be unemployed as their white counterparts. As a result of the 2008 recession, the black middle class lost more than half its net worth. The white middle class lost about 14% of its net worth. And the average white person's net wealth is still 4 to 5 times what the average black person's net wealth is. It is often said that when the American economy sneezes, middle-class whites catch a cold, but African Americans catch pneumonia. Sometimes things don't change at all. Why are race relations in America burdened by this seeming contradiction? That things have clearly improved for African Americans over the last 50 years, but African Americans still lag behind whites at the same rate in virtually every category, health, wealth, education, social capital, as they did 50 years ago. To borrow a phrase from black novelist Ralph Ellison, blacks in America feel they, quote, move without moving, unquote. And they are right to feel that way. Perhaps Martin Luther King Jr. put it best in his 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. Quote, there is not even a common language between Negroes and whites when the term equality is used. Negro and white have a fundamentally different definition. Negroes have proceeded from a premise that equality means what it says, and they have taken white Americans at their word when they talk of it as an objective. But most whites in America proceed from a premise that equality is a loose expression for improvement. White America is not even psychologically organized to close the gap. Essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful and less obvious, but in most respects, to retain it. Most of the abrasions between Negroes and white liberals arise from this fact, unquote. No one denies the existence of this gap, but the cause of the gap is hotly debated. Most African Americans feel that whites have the political might, the tremendous economic advantage, the institutional power, and the far greater amount of social capital to make something change, to make equality happen. But blacks feel that whites want to evade the idea that they are morally responsible for this inequality, which is why they wish to ignore it. Many whites, on the other hand, feel that blacks are trying to evade the responsibility they bear for their own situation by, in effect, shifting the blame to a deep-pocket defendant. According to this view, blacks are largely the cause of their own problems because they behave in such a dysfunctional manner. Besides, some whites feel that with affirmative action, various anti-poverty programs, and other interventions, that all that can be done for blacks has been done. The most talented African Americans have taken advantage of these policies. The rest don't want to. It's that simple. This impasse about the gap between black and white, which dates back to the end of Reconstruction in 1877, signals discontent and anger among many blacks and fatigue and impatience among many whites. Blacks are incensed by the arrogance of whites, and whites are annoyed by the militant special pleading of blacks. What makes race relations a true conundrum in the United States is this. The drastic inequality of blacks and whites makes every solution that gets tried eventually become part of the problem. This conundrum is exacerbated by the fact that whites and blacks hold such divergent views on so many subjects as almost to constitute different versions of reality. Take, for instance, the black and white views of the O.J. Simpson trial, the black and white views of the dogfighting case of football player Michael Vick, the black and white views on corporal punishment, the black and white views on the police, the black and white views on capital punishment, or most recently, the black and white views on the Charlie Hebdo murders, and of course, the black and white views on the cause of the racial gap. Let's start with this. The problems that blacks face arise not from how they behave, but from how they have been perceived and categorized historically. Black people were invented as a category in a grand scheme called race. Blacks did not invent the concept of race. If they had, they certainly would not have put themselves on the bottom. Whites invented race. King was right in his observation about the jousting over equality. For the concept of race is an elaborate and cunning defense of inequality. Race was and is about the naturalness and inevitability of inequality. We will never have equality as long as we have race. Since the end of World War II, the United States has been trying, with occasional measures of success, to dismantle its racial caste system. In part, World War II necessitated this, as the idea of racial superiority was no longer considered legitimate or respectable ideology because of the racist genocidal mania of the Nazis. This dismantling has not been easy because the American racial caste system was such a totalizing concept. Within it, races were defined not just by physical or biological characteristics, but by emotional, mental, and even spiritual traits. And a group's racial definition not only explained its place in the world, but its fate. What made race as a concept seem inescapable in the Western world, including the United States, was the fact that it was, for well over 150 years, endorsed by the entire membership of the educational and opinion-making apparatus. Scientists, humanists, journalists, poets, teachers, politicians, merchants, all believed in and promoted the idea of races, and nearly all believed in racial inequality. Race did not simply dominate American life. More importantly, it suffused every pore of American life. Everything was racialized in America, from medical treatment to the selling of popular music, from professional baseball to mortuaries. The concept of race was compelling because it seemed so vividly to explain the difference that human difference makes. And it also justified a world where whites ruled blacks. What made this comprehensive system of categories especially problematic for African-descended peoples was that they came to the United States as slaves who were stripped of their languages, religions, and politics. They were forced to adopt the language, religion, and politics of the people who enslaved them without actually being integrated into their captors' culture. African Americans had the language, religion, and politics of their captors, but lacked any historical connection to the European cultural tools that they had to use. This made blacks culturally orphans and exiles. They were treated like a defeated people or the spoils of war. Blacks were constantly reminded of their subordinate status by being forced for such a long time to use their captors' cultural tools on their captors' terms. The history of African Americans can be seen in one regard as a series of attempts to redefine themselves in an effort to escape the prison house of race theory that so totally subjugated them. The story of African Americans is the story of redefinition. That is why blacks have changed so frequently in the 20th century what they wish to be called. African Americans thought three things would free them from their inferior status. I gotta drink something. It's getting a little dry. This is harder than teaching. African Americans thought three things would free them from their inferior status. First, the arrival of social science and Marxist analysis, because social science and Marxism would challenge the idea that blacks were biologically inferior and would offer instead an explanation of social and structural forces that conspired to keep blacks subjugated and gave whites built-in advantages. Second was the creation of a usable black history that would not only change black people psychologically, but inspire them politically to change their situation, to show to inspire them to change politically, to inspire them to change their situation, to show black people the history that would show black people that they indeed had a rendezvous with destiny. Third was the preoccupation with the creation of great art, literature and music particularly. That would make black experience profound by making it both particular and universal, able to speak to other blacks, but also to speak to people who were not black. The NAACP, an organization of blacks and liberals and liberal committed whites, embarked on an extraordinary task of breaking legal racial segregation in this country with Supreme Court challenges. Along with the NAACP, African Americans used the strength of their churches, their colleges, and other organizations to mount protest, unending protests, boycotts, marches, sit-ins, and the threats of boycotts, marches, and sit-ins. African Americans were also caught on the tide of three major shifts that profoundly affected them. The first was the move from rural South to the urban North during the Great Migration of World War I and World War II. This made the race problem a national problem and not just a Southern problem. Second was the rise of the American welfare state. This greatly expanded the ability of the federal government to intervene in the affairs of the states, and it also committed the federal government to some notion of social justice. Third was the rise of anti-colonialism and nationalism among nations of color, and our competition with the Soviet Union that was called the Cold War. Without these shifts, black Americans would never have made the headway that they did. Social science in many ways dominated how nearly every liberal and leftist saw blacks, stressing the disparities and gaps between the races, the deficiencies of black life and experience, the inner cruelties, pressures, and fears of black communities, the way white institutions and the marketplace worked against African Americans. For some blacks, social science slowly began to become part of the problem. Noted African-American novelist Ralph Ellison disliked the famous sociological treatise that condemned the racial caste system in America. He strongly disliked An American Dilemma by Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal, which was published in 1944. Ellison hated the sociology that was used in the 1954 Brown decision that ended school segregation. Ellison hated it because he felt it distorted black life. that it impoverished being black as an identity, made being black just a form of problem solving. Social science for Ellison did not seem to lessen the stigma of being black, but rather intensified it. So strong was this feeling, this intellectual proclivity toward distrusting social science, that a small group of African American scholars and intellectuals emerged in the 1980s called Ellisonians. They felt strongly that black life was not the total of its disparities and its deficiencies. Blacks were more than the gap that separates them from whites. Ellisonians felt that in collectivizing blacks as social science tends to do, it neglected the importance of the individual and the individual's interior life. An individual has choices to make. An individual seeks his or her own agency. Black people are not trying to live their lives as a form of self-defense, nor do they simply live a life of reaction to racism. And the Ellisonians were equally impatient with leftist scholars who see blacks only as a vast repository of resistance and anti-Americanism. The militant, foul-mouthed, hard-drinking, demagogic, in the white folks' face NAACP leader Cecil B. Moore, a Marine who fought in the Pacific during World War II, would weep with his hand over his heart whenever he heard the national anthem. Blacks in this country have, with great sacrifice, accommodated as much as they have resisted. The Ellisonians' quarrel with the social science has forced everyone to think more deeply about race than perhaps they had before. Let me conclude with a brief story. In Philadelphia, in a small alleyway across from the Mother Bethel AME Church at 6th and Lombard Streets, lived my great-aunt Jenny. That is, until urban renewal swept her and the other blacks from this neighborhood in the early 1960s. I remember this old woman with iron gray hair, all done up in plaits, no teeth, and a strong, whiny Southern accent. She grew up in Mobile, Alabama, left school after the 3rd or 4th grade to pick cotton. She married at some point, had a son named Josie to whom she sent money, which he spent on cheap liquor and bad women. He never sent her any. My great-aunt Jenny dipped snuff, periodically spitting streams of dark saliva in a tin can, a habit I found by turns fascinating and disgusting. Her home in this cramped, shabby alleyway consisted of 2 tiny rooms, heated by a pot-bellied coal stove, upon which during the winter she would cook yams. She always gave a yam to me when I visited. I didn't like them much, but I ate them anyway. Always on the stove was a hot comb with a big container of Royal Crown pomade nearby. She would sometimes straighten my mother's hair. She was the sister of my mother's mother. My great-aunt Jenny and my mother were very close, especially after my father died. We visited her often when I was a small boy. I recall that my great-aunt Jenny had only one book, a well-worn Bible, but she loved comic books, particularly Tarzan comics, and comic books with names like My Greatest Adventure, Journey into Mystery, House of Secrets, and especially a comic book called Tales to Astonish, which featured stories about radioactive monsters, invaders from space, and supernatural tales where greedy people got their just desserts. What I remember most on many fall and winter evenings was being with my great-aunt Jenny's little hovel, eating a baked yam. We would be wrapped in her ugly but warm green quilt and reading Tales to Astonish. The semi-literate old lady and the little boy who was just learning to read. I came across the word Tipperary in one of the stories and asked her where that was. She told me it was a town in Texas. At the time, as time went on, she rather elaborated a bit, and Tipperary became a colored town in Texas with colored cowboys and a colored sheriff. And there were colored farmers and ranchers and colored cattle rustlers and horse thieves. She made a little mythology of all this and said how she and I would go to Tipperary one day and I would ride a horse and learn to hunt. I was eager to go to Tipperary with my great Aunt Jenny. This past December, I was in Philadelphia to visit my mother, and we spoke about my great Aunt Jenny. She was a good old soul, my mother said. She had a wonderful life. And for a moment, I could not understand this. How did this poor, nearly illiterate woman, some cotton picker and house cleaner with a no-good son, herself sick with diabetes and hypertension and collective heart failure, beaten down by brutal Southern racism and sexism as a child, have a wonderful life? She never had a car or a telephone or even teeth. Poverty and racism had robbed her of her life. While I was in Philadelphia this winter, I went to the Mother Bethel Church, the oldest black church in America, started by Richard Allen in 1795. It is, in fact, the oldest continuously black-owned piece of property in America. I looked at the church and I looked across the street at where my great Aunt Jenny used to live. It is all gone now, except for Mother Bethel and a mural a block away celebrating the fact that W.E.B. Du Bois lived in this neighborhood when he wrote the first social science book about urban blacks called The Philadelphia Negro. One would never know blacks ever lived here. I realized then how wrong I was about my great Aunt Jenny. I realized that my great Aunt Jenny did indeed have a wonderful life. She took things as they came. She worked. She loved people well. And she seemed to say with her whole being, I ain't nobody but myself. She was happy in a way that made me happy as a child. I realized with her comic books that she shared with me, she was trying to teach me that stories, like love, will save us somehow, whether we want them to or not. How lacking can black life be, black critic Stanley Crouch once said to me. How lacking can it be if it produced you, your wife, your family, and all the black people you associate with? It was important that my great Aunt Jenny lived here. Her life was the glory of the racial gap. I finally understood that. People, black and white, have obsessed so about fixing black people, but it is infinitely harder in the end to accept them for who and what they are. It is a long, long way to Tipperary. Maybe my great Aunt Jenny made it there. I hope she did. And if she did, all I can say to her is, I'll see you when I get there. Thank you very much.